Calling Chris Anderson in London. How you doing,
Yeah,
Chris?
this is Chris Anderson in London. I'm doing well. I'm calling Rick Byer back in Chicago.
I'm here in Chicago. Chris, happy Super Bowl Sunday. I know that you wait all year for this day and how much it means to you.
Are the Red Sox playing?
Welcome, everybody, to History Happy Hour. A special thank you to Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours for helping us bring you this show. Check out their rich offering of military history tours at stephenambrosetours.com. And I don't know if you're watching live, if you're watching on replay, if you're listening on the HHH podcast, however you find your History Happy Hour, we are glad to see you here. Today we'll be talking about the man who some people think is the best mayor in American history, Fiorello La Guardia. And so we'll get to that in a minute or two. Let us know that you're here and what you're drinking. And yes, indeed, Chris, despite your resistance to knowing anything about it, it's Super Bowl Sunday with Kansas City, San Francisco, and Taylor Swift all competing for our attention.
Oh, okay. I'm sure I'll see that in my news feed. I mean, more importantly, no, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the game starts at 11:30 p.m. your time. Will you be staying up or you'll be trying to avoid the news about it tomorrow morning?
No, because I'm going to be wide awake, basking in the glow of Arsenal's crushing victory over West Ham today. So
Arsenal takes West Ham, and this is meaningful because
Arsenal is God's football team.
Oh, okay. I want to thank everybody who supports us via Patreon. And Chris, we have an updated list here.
Oh, yeah.
So we added Craig Condon to it. But now there's a hole in the middle column of Top Shelf patrons. So we need somebody else to join us. And I did notice that Doug McCord increased his contribution from $20 a month to $22 a month.
We appreciate that, Doug.
Thank you, Doug. Give us a little explanation on why, because I'm sure, knowing Doug, that there's a very good reason that.
Well, I'm sure it's because he's an Arsenal fan.
Oh, you think he's giving a little extra because Arsenal's there? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm not really going to even dignify that with a response. Chris, have we killed enough time? Are we ready? Have I missed anything here? I don't think so.
You could say hello.
No, yeah, I did miss something. So tell me who's watching.
Well, I was Ken Redding is watching. Jim Stark, who has a Chivas and soda. Dolphins Ted is calling from Virginia. Jan is from St. Louis, but she's not drinking, but that's okay.
I see Les from rainy Texas, and I see Lizzie Borden here, and Jim Stark is saying, hey, the Super Bowl might be coming to London one of these days, and then you're going to have a harder time not paying attention to it.
I'd be happy to sublet my place for that, then. I could make a little bit of money.
You could, therefore. Okay, so now I think we're ready. If you give me a cue, we can get started.
The bar is open.
The bar is open, and on tap today is Fiorello La Guardia, who served as a congressman for 7 terms, I think, and as mayor of New York, and who became one of the 20th century's most colorful politicians. And our guest, Terry Golway, has written a book about him entitled, I Never Did Like Politics. This book, Chris, is so new, it hasn't come out yet. It's coming out a week from Tuesday. So here it is. We're the early birds on this one. So Terry has a history PhD from Rutgers. He has written books on FDR, Tammany Hall, Nathaniel Greene, and many others. He's also been a senior editor at Politico, a columnist and city editor at the New York Observer, and a member of the editorial board of the New York Times. So we want to welcome Terry Golway here to the show. Terry, thanks for joining us for History Happy Hour.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
And we want to know, did you bring a cocktail with you today?
A fine bit of Ireland's best, Jameson.
All right.
Excellent. Mr. Anderson, how about you?
Glen Turret 12 year.
All right.
And you?
I've got a Sam Adams,
Sam Adams.
Nice sticking with the basics here on a day like this. Okay. So, Terry, the subtitle of your book and I did get further than that in my reading, I just want to say, but I did also read the subtitle, is How Fiorello La Guardia Became America's Mayor and Why He Still Matters. So, why does he still matter?
Because so many of the things that animated him, that got him going, didn't take much to get him going, but so many of those issues are still with us. Immigration, how to run a city, is there a Democratic or Republican way to pick up the garbage? How to communicate your message. I mean, there was no better communicator other than Franklin Roosevelt in his time than Fiorello La Guardia. The people of New York knew exactly what he was thinking at all times, and he didn't even have Twitter, right? So communication. But the one issue that comes to mind actually was before he was mayor, when he was a congressman in the 1920s, and it was a real, as you know, as historians, the 1920s, the 2020s, oh my God, they are so similar. Immigration, culture, identity, all of those issues were in play in America in the 1920s. Guess what? Here we are, right? And they're in play again. So he matters because he didn't give a damn, I think, whether he got reelected next time. I mean, I'm sure he wanted to be reelected, but it seemed to me that he was a politician who really did put his conscience first. And I think that's one of the reasons why reformers loved him. And he always was himself, which is why everybody else loved him. So he still matters because he was authentic. And in terms of, my own views, he was a defender of the voiceless. He gave cliche, he gave voice to the voiceless. Oh my God, what a voice.
Yeah. So I mean, I hate to say it, but I think a lot of points of reference for LaGuardia now is they fly into an airport and they go, "Oh, this is named after somebody." So I mean, just to kind of level the playing field a bit, tell us a little bit about his background, where he's coming from, before we get into his political life. But just who is this person? Where does he come from? What's kind of his story?
That's a great question, because that's part of it. Now, I was born in New York. I lived in New York for 40 years. I sort of am a New Yorker in exile in New Jersey at the moment. Been here 32 years. Can't believe it. But even with my, I didn't know a lot of LaGuardia's background. So to your point, he was born in New York of Italian immigrant parents. His mother was an Italian Jew. His father was an Italian Catholic who had sort of said, "I'm not Catholic anymore. I'm nothing." So
I quit. Yeah.
Yeah, he was born in New York, but this quintessential New Yorker actually left New York at the age of 3. He has no childhood memories in New York because his father joined the army as a musician. And so he lived the life of an army brat. And his most memorable stay was out in Arizona, in Prescott, Arizona. He says those were the best days of his life, out in the dusty desert of Arizona. And I remember reading that saying, really? Fiorello La Guardia? Prescott, Arizona? His parents then moved back to Italy. And migration from Italy was sort of like that, mostly of young Italian men, not families, but a lot of Italians came here, worked, went back to Italy, then came back, and so on and so forth. And the LaGuardias did that. They felt that their American dream really wasn't working out. So they bring young Fiorello and his sister back to Italy, where they stay for quite some time. His father dies, and he gets a job. He talks his way into a job at the consulate in what is today Hungary, and learns languages. He apparently had the skill that I don't have for language. He learns 5 languages, then goes back to New York, tells his mother, "I want to be somebody." And he wasn't going to be somebody in Italy in the early 20th century. He was going to be somebody in New York. Goes back to New York, gets a job as a translator, eventually, becomes a lawyer, and then runs for Congress and wins in 1916. And that's when Fiorello becomes Fiorello.
So he gets elected. Oh, go ahead, Chris. Did you?
No, I just want to add really quickly, because a question coming out of what you just said. His family goes back to Italy, so and I'm glad that comes out in the book, because my master's I did a lot of work on immigration, and the myth is that everybody comes to America and stays, but there's a lot of this kind of back and forth, and I thought that was an interesting thing. But one of the things that strikes me in the book is that how incredibly patriotic he is, right?
Yes.
And so
yes,
that, and what I just wanted to ask you a little bit about was, so his parents, the American dream and their version doesn't quite work out. They go back to Italy, but they instill in him a pretty fervent patriotism. Yeah.
It's amazing. And of course, LaGuardia is a pretty left-wing, by New York standards, I suppose, left-wing Republican. But one of I divided the book into 4 sections because four themes in his life. And the first theme is patriot. He loved America. And I think that was one of the reasons why his dissents from America were so passionate, because America let him down. Like, America let him down when immigration restrictions were passed. America let him down, he felt, in the 1920s, when the Coolidge administration basically cut taxes on the rich and in his view, hurt the poor. So his dissents were filled with passion, which comes from love. And to further your point about his patriotism, he said, he voted in favor of America's entry into World War I, and then immediately said, if I have voted for war, it is incumbent upon me to join that war. And he, as a sitting congressman, was a combat pilot in Italy. There is. And, he loved being in the army so much that his best friends called him not Fiorello, called him not mayor, they called him major. That was the title he wanted to be known by for the rest of his life. If you were buddies with Fiorello, you'd better call him major.
So he clung to that. So he I want to. There's so many aspects to this story that one can jump into, and your book is not strictly in chronological order, and so it kind of moves around. So we'll kind of move around too. Fiorello LaGuardia was a Republican, and I'm putting that in quotes because it seems pretty accurate, because he was a left-wing Republican, which is something that is pretty rare these days. And I mean, he at one point actually runs on the socialist ticket. So you could argue that he's a socialist Republican. Talk about his party affiliation, how it ebbed and flowed, and how do we understand it?
Well, the main reason he was a Republican is that he hated Tammany Hall, which was Democrat, right? The Tammany Hall was the famous or infamous Democratic machine in New York. He, in his memoir, he wrote a memoir basically on his deathbed, talking about being out in Arizona and reading the New York press about the various depredations that Tammany Hall was pulling off in the 1890s in New York. And, he just hated machine politics. So if he's not going to be a Democrat in New York, he's going to be a Republican.
Sure.
But as you point out, he was he was a progressive Republican in the same sense that there were other progressives in that era in Washington as well. He was not alone in that, but it was sort of a very small faction. But because he didn't support Calvin Coolidge for re-election in 1924, the Republicans basically kicked him off the ballot. So the only way he could win re-election in 1926 was to find another party that would endorse him.
And it wasn't going to be the Democrats.
It wasn't going to be the Democrats, although they did in 1918, because he came back a war hero. And the Democrats said, okay, we're not going to run against him. We'll endorse him.
He was a Republican, a Democrat, and a socialist at various times in his career.
At various times. Although if he were here, he would hit the ceiling and you would be the subject of a LaGuardian browbeating, because he said, I'm no socialist, right? He said, I'm a capitalist. I happen to agree with some of the things that the socialists will say, but I am not a socialist.
The only other socialist in Congress said that you're the party whip now, Fiorello, which I think
that's right.
Sorry.
But you know, I mean, that was the only way. And by the way, that was huge in New York. That the Republicans did their best to bury him in 1926, and he bounced back as a socialist. You know, and then of course then continued to run as a Republican. But you know, in the days that people remember him as, you know, mayor, the 3 terms he served as mayor, you know, his best friend was Franklin Roosevelt, his best political friend, who obviously was a progressive Democrat. And he was a New Dealer. And, you know, he endorsed Franklin Roosevelt in 32, and there he is, and 36, and 1940. So he was a Roosevelt Republican, which, you know, is kind of a term we don't hear much about, to tell you the truth. There weren't many of them, but he was one.
But so I mean, just stepping back a bit, how does this Italian immigrant American, I mean, he's a lot of things. Where does the light bulb go off and he say to himself, politics? Right? Because, you know, if you're a man on the make and he's up against it, right? He's got a kind of in terms of that time, he's got sort of a checkered background. He's not the quote unquote ideal candidate. What makes him think that this is a place that I can?
Well, when he was a mere lawyer, this is before his public career starts. He sort of cultivated the Italian American community in Manhattan, in Greenwich Village at the time, which is where he was living. He wasn't living in Little Italy, and his parents, by the way, didn't live in Little Italy either. They chose a more bohemian neighborhood in Manhattan, Greenwich Village. So he surrounded himself with these sort of middle-class Italian intellectuals in the 1908, 1910, 1912, in that period. And you know, he writes about it in his memoir, and I write about it in my book, which is better. The world of ideas was opening up to him, and he got involved with, you know, various fraternal organizations and things like that, and various Italian organizations. And basically his friends in the Italian American community basically said, you know what, he's the one, because there were no Italian Americans in Congress at that point.
Right. Yeah.
So they realized that here's a guy, and, you know, look, Fiorello La Guardia liked the spotlight. You know, he liked the attention. And as he had told his mother, I want to be somebody. So the Republican Party in Manhattan was so weak, as it still is, that in 1914, for example, he became the Republican candidate for Congress basically by raising his hand and saying, okay, I'll do it, because no one else wanted to. And he surprised everybody by losing by only a few thousand votes instead of, 8,000 votes. And then he comes back and wins and beats the same guy, an Irish American guy, in 1916. Among his lines of attack, the incumbent congressman, this Irish guy, was a bartender, and he said he's not a good Irishman. He's not even a good bartender. How he knew that, we don't know. Maybe it was just a rumor. But one of the things about LaGuardia is that the other way he would sort of fit in today's politics, maybe in an unfortunate way, is Fiorello. He was good with the low blow. I mean, he was only 5'2" anyway, so but there's a low blow. But he was a bit of a demagogue. There's no question about that. And as somebody once said, he once said, I'll out demagogue anybody. And he could do it in 5 languages. So,
right.
Well, sometimes he reminds me of AOC, right? Sort of this progressive left-wing person. Sometimes he reminds me of Marjorie Taylor Greene. There he is. He's voting to impeach Treasury Secretary Andrew Mellon. So is he more interested in attention than getting things done, or does he marry those two things?
I think as a congressman, he was interested in attention. As a mayor, he was interested in getting things done, and that's the nature of the two jobs. I mean, he was made to be an executive. I can't believe he was happy in Congress, particularly because he was, his main job in Congress was to basically say, I object, right? I object to prohibition. I object to immigration restriction. I object to what we would call today trickle-down economics. So he was that. There's a little of Rudy Giuliani going on here too, because while he was very tough on the police, when his first day as mayor, he goes to police headquarters and basically says, okay, if you've been taking payoffs, quit now, right? If you think you're going to get promoted because you know politics, quit now. right? And it says, I'm gonna reform the police. But at another point, he basically says, and this actually sounds like Donald Trump. He says at one point, I'm not going to object if the cops rough up some people because some people need to be roughed up, right? So he contains multitudes, as Walt Whitman might say.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I'm interested in, and I'd really like to get your take on, obviously he stresses throughout his public life that he's not a politician. He doesn't like politicians. He doesn't play politics, but clearly he is a politician. So, I mean, how much of that is his persona and his act? How much of it is he really playing the game? And how is he able to play that political game when he's pissed off everybody in his own party and the Democrats aren't going to vote for him because he's not a Democrat? So how does he pull this off?
By force of personality. I mean, the X factor here is Fiorello La Guardia was an unbelievable showman, and he could sell anything. But you're right. One of the things that I actually found a little less than attractive is La Guardia's insistence that he wasn't a politician. Because, we see that today, right? Everybody who runs for office, from dog catcher to president of the United States, says they're not politicians. And to which and I've been covering politics for 40 years. I never actually asked a politician this question because I probably was afraid to be killed. But I want to say, why are you so ashamed of your chosen profession, right? I am a journalist, right? I'm a historian. I'm happy to be. I worked hard for that, right? So, in fact, the New York Times in an editorial, I think in the early 40s, basically said, Mayor, you've got to knock off the I'm not a politician thing. And your contempt for politics is really draining on us, because if you're contemptuous of politics, that means you're contemptuous of what Franklin Roosevelt is doing and what Winston Churchill is doing in Great Britain, right? These are two politicians who are not ashamed of being politicians, and you kind of like them. So, what's with that? But I think it was very much a part of his persona. He associated politicians with grafters, with Tammany, and I'm biased here, but I feel he didn't give Tammany enough credit for the good that it did, particularly in the 1920s. But he associated politics with something dirty, and he wasn't dirty. So therefore, he couldn't be a politician, and he got away with it. Again, I think his everyman persona helped him a great deal. People said, "Yeah, he's not a politician. He's like me. He can talk to me."
Back in 1976, when I was a student radio reporter, I covered the Birch Bayh campaign in the New Hampshire primary, and Birch Bayh was running on being a politician. I'm a politician. It takes a politician to get things done. And we all know that, his presidency was long and well.
Got a little short.
And maybe La Guardia was onto something there, well in advance of Birch Bayh and the many others who more lately have claimed to not be politicians. But striking in the way that he seemed to personify a politician, almost at the same time as denying that he was one. I wanted to talk. We'll get to his being mayor shortly, talking about the 1920s when he is a congressman, and there's a couple of big issues there that you tie together, which is the anti-immigrant and the anti-drinking movements, and you actually mentioned that, and both of which La Guardia is opposed to. Now, was this kind of connection between them that you make, and maybe you can enlarge on that a little bit, was this something that was obvious to everyone at the time, or was this like the quiet part that didn't get mentioned?
Oh, I think it was pretty obvious. I mean, and all I need say is that some of the loudest voices in favor of prohibition were the Ku Klux Klan, right? The Ku Klux Klan were dry as dust, or at least they claimed to be. So the association of the evils of drink and the degradation of American cities and immigrants, I mean, they were all tied together. It was pretty explicit. La Guardia was certainly not the first to make that connection, nor was I. Prohibition, many historians today interpret that as sort of the beginning of the anti-immigrant movement, which came to fruition in 1924. But if you look at the way the political dialogue is played out in the newspapers of the time, it's cities, immigrants, drink. They're all connected. And LaGuardia was an enthusiast for, I'm not going to say he was an enthusiast for liquor, but he certainly was anti-prohibition.
But he even brews beer on the street in New York City. Yeah. Again, maybe to get attention, but in order to say, hey, why is this illegal?
Right. But what he actually did it twice. First in his congressional office, and it was a total attention getter, right? I mean, it was clickbait. There's no doubt about it, but we didn't have clicks back then. But what he was able to do, and I forget what the two ingredients were, but he was able to buy two perfectly lawful ingredients, mix them together in his congressional office. And of course, he very cleverly invites reporters to this event, because who would more appreciate beer than a bunch of reporters. And he basically creates this brew that he then hands out to the reporters and say, hey, how do you like that? That's beer, right? And of course, the anti-prohibition crowd, which is, look, I mean, it's very evangelical Protestant. It's very rural. It's very Southern, right? The Prohibition League and all these other defenders of prohibition, they hit the ceiling. They want to know why LaGuardia hasn't been arrested. And he wasn't. So about 2 weeks later, he goes out on a street corner in New York and does the same thing, invites reporters because, journalists drink, come on, right?
And a cop comes by.
And a cop comes by, and LaGuardia says to the cop, come on, look at me. I'm making beer. This is totally illegal. You really should be arresting me. The police officer, who is unnamed, a wise soul, he says, I'm not going to have any part of this. Are you kidding me? And he rightly points out, as surely LaGuardia knew, that New York in 1923 had enacted legislation that basically said the law enforcement in New York State will not enforce the Volstead Act, which was the act that punished prohibition. It was the way that the prohibition was enforced. So basically, New York got out of the business of enforcing prohibition. If the feds wanted to come in and arrest LaGuardia, then it was up to them. But Al Smith, who was governor of New York at the time, Al Smith State Police, New York City's police, were not making arrests for the Volstead Act, not making arrests related to prohibition. So that cop very wisely said, basically, not my job, Congressman, and walked away.
So, we were talking earlier, since I'm not a New Yorker, never have been, being born and raised in Boston, I think New York is the evil empire. I have much to learn about LaGuardia, and I learned a lot about it in your book. So, but I'm interested in kind of some of the things that go to make him who he is. I asked about immigration. And you say in the book, that he was a born leader, all right. But along the way, he also learned how to lead. So could you tell us a little bit about what you meant when you said that, and how did he learn to lead? Who were the teachers that kind of that he used as role models?
I think he learned to lead very early on as mayor of New York, because this is his first executive job, right? I mean, in Congress, you don't really lead, right? You right. Make speeches, you vote. But what he learned early on as mayor, he takes over as mayor on January 1st, 1934, in the middle of the Depression. And he's basically handed a budget that is swimming in red ink. And there's not a whole lot of revenue coming in. So he tries at first on his own sheer force of personality to impose a budget on New York. So he's coming in as, this is a guy who likes to spend, who's going to show that he likes to spend money. Like his ideology was to expand government, right? And now he's given a job where he's got to cut the budget. And he learns very early on that he can't do it himself, that he's going to have to find partners to get stuff done, even though he loathes other politicians. So even on day one, he basically says to the city council, or the board of aldermen, it was called back then, look, here's what you have to do. You've got to sign off on this so I can then go to Albany, which is something else he found out, that and every mayor of New York has found out, that they say they want to do things, but Albany, the state capital, actually controls a lot of how New York City operates, right?
Right.
So in order to enact these budget cuts, he was going to need the state's approval. So, but first he needs the board of aldermen, which is, again, the city council today. And the president of the board of aldermen is interviewed after the mayor basically says, okay, here's the deal. This is what we're going to do, right? And the board of aldermen said, what the mayor doesn't understand is that we have to do this by majority vote. And they go back to LaGuardia, and LaGuardia says, around here, I'm the majority. Well, nice quote, but actually wrong. And throughout the spring of 1934, all of a sudden, LaGuardia is negotiating with people he loathes. He's negotiating with these Tammany Democrats up in Albany. They reject 3 of his budgets, maybe even 4, even though the governor of New York at the time, Herbert Lehman, who has succeeded Franklin Roosevelt as governor, Roosevelt is now president, he's going up to Albany, on an almost weekly basis and sitting down with politicians, cutting deals. And I think those very early months of his mayoralty, the first 3 or 4 months that he was mayor, he learned that, you know what, in order to lead, you've got to negotiate. You can't just impose your will as much as you would like to.
Right.
So LaGuardia becomes mayor in 1933 of New York.
He was elected in 33. Yeah.
Elected in 33. So which is kind of interesting because he's a 7-term GOP congressman. He's gone down to flaming defeat because Franklin Roosevelt has won the election in 1932 and become president. And then he manages the next year having it's sort of weird. He's kind of an ally of FDR all of a sudden, and he's winning the mayor's race after he'd run for mayor at least once, if not twice before, and lost. Yeah. So he what happens? What changes for him that he gets defeated in 32 and elected in 33?
He was elected with 40% of the vote. That's and this is where
the fix was in.
Well,
maybe
we're still trying to figure that out. So what happened in 33? There was a Democratic incumbent who was an incompetent, right? Who just was not going to be able to make the decisions. His name was O'Brien. At one point, the press said to him, "Mayor, who's going to be your police commissioner?" And he said, "I don't know. They haven't told me yet." They meaning Tammany Hall, right? Yeah, it's like, okay. And he was clearly in over his head, right? So he's the incumbent mayor, so he's going to run against O'Brien, straight one-on-one. And then 2 of Franklin Roosevelt's confidants in New York, a guy called Ed Flynn and James Farley, who is the Postmaster General and the chair of the Democratic National Committee, get another candidate, this guy named McKee, who had been acting mayor before. And everybody thinks McKee is really good and really competent. And they form something called the Recovery Party. All this is being done with Roosevelt's knowledge, right? And Flynn, one of very few political bosses who actually wrote a memoir, because basically political bosses generally don't write things down, right? But Flynn did. And Flynn writes that they fully expected Franklin Roosevelt to endorse the Recovery Party candidate, Joseph McKee. He never did. So McKee on the Recovery Party, O'Brien on the Democratic Party split the Democratic vote, allowing LaGuardia to win with 40% of the vote. That's how it happened.
And so maybe Franklin Roosevelt was doing a little scheming there.
No.
Yes, hard to believe, right? The sainted Franklin Roosevelt, right? Oh.
So, I mean, since we were just saying that, and since Rick just showed the picture, tell us a little bit about that relationship. I mean, obviously, there's politics to play, but is it purely dare I say, a political relationship, or do they have some kind of appreciation and respect? I mean, what does Roosevelt say about?
They had tremendous respect for each other. I couldn't tell you how many times LaGuardia was in the White House, but he basically had carte blanche in the Oval Office. This is a mayor, right? He's not a senator. He's not a Supreme Court justice. He's not, right? He's a mayor. He's in the Oval Office so often. 1 out of every 7 WPA dollars is spent in New York City. You know, that's nice. That's why New York City has all these, including on LaGuardia Airport. And I think they got along famously, in part, of course, LaGuardia needed to get along with Roosevelt. Roosevelt, not so much with LaGuardia, right? But I think as the relationship developed, I think they formed a real bond. And then as LaGuardia began speaking out against Hitler and speaking out against the Nazis, I think Roosevelt really admired the fact that he was, I mean, basically LaGuardia was doing in the United States what Churchill was doing in Britain.
And he starts doing that in 33.
Oh,
I mean, he starts that before Churchill, really.
Yes, actually, that's a good point. Yeah. So I think Roosevelt really admired that, because at one point the State Department apologizes to the Nazis because of LaGuardia's intemperate attack on what do you call him, the brown-shirted fanatic. He referred to Hitler. And Roosevelt says, you know, instead of issuing this apology, we should have LaGuardia should have LaGuardia come in and give him a medal. So I think they had a great appreciation for that. But at the one point where LaGuardia wanted to really cash in on the favors that he had done for Roosevelt, like endorsing him all the 3 times that he ran when LaGuardia was mayor. LaGuardia wanted to go back in uniform. It would have been an extra large, I imagine. Well, an extra large one way, short the other way.
Short the other.
But he wanted to be a brigadier general during World War II, and he appealed to Roosevelt personally several times. And Roosevelt wants to do it. You can see he wants to do it, but people in the military command are basically saying, "Really? I mean, he's serious." And at one point, he does write a letter to, I think it was George Marshall, who was chairman of.
I think it was Stinson. I think it was.
To Stinson, right? The Secretary of War, and says, "Could you do something, please?" And then nothing ever comes of it. And LaGuardia was very disappointed. He wanted to be. Look, LaGuardia always wanted to be where the action was, and he felt like the action was in Europe, right? The action was not in New York City. And the New York Times is telling him, and other newspapers are telling him, you could do some pretty nice war service by, you know, managing New York City in the war. I mean, that'd be nice too, right? But it wasn't enough for him. It wasn't exciting enough.
Well, I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Terry Golway, who's the author of I Never Did Like Politics, a book about Fiorello La Guardia. And you write that LaGuardia wanted to be the chief at every fire, the general at every battlefield. And so, FDR didn't make him a brigadier general, but why doesn't he end up as a senator, as a secretary of war, or some other cabinet position? I mean, he is buddies with FDR. He's got tons of ambition. Do you have any speculation on why he kind of caps out at the mayor level?
Because he died. I mean, seriously. I mean, he might have, but, you know, he died of pancreatic cancer in 1947. His mayoral term ended on New Year's Eve, 1945. So he didn't, you know, he was only alive for about 18 months more. There was talk of him being Secretary of War in 1940 after Roosevelt wins his 3rd term, about, you know, basically Roosevelt would have had to fire Henry Stinson, and who's a Republican, and bring in LaGuardia. There is talk about it. Roosevelt, you know, sort of denies it in a cagey kind of way, but the press is filled with that sort of speculation. Obviously, it doesn't happen. You know, he definitely. But he did get a consolation prize in the sense that Roosevelt made him head of civil defense in the United States, which you would think would be a full-time job. But LaGuardia, because he was still mayor too. So he was involved in wartime stuff, and I think that made him happy. And I think had he lived, he probably would. He might have run for Senate or for governor, maybe when Tom Dewey instead of Tom Dewey. But sadly he just didn't. You know, he didn't have much of a post mayoralty life. But there was still life in him. I mean, he was still wanted to be part of the action. But you know, life had other plans for him.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'd like you to talk about is. Obviously, one of the kind of the tragedies of America, or one of the shames of America, is our history of race relations, or if you want to call them that. But at one point, the war's begun. We're ramping up our industry. Government jobs are going all over the place, and none are going to African Americans. And A. Philip Randolph is saying, this isn't right. This is going to stop. And if you don't do anything about it, we're going to march. And we've talked about it with some of our other guests on the show about this march that's going to happen on Washington, demanding that African Americans are allowed to participate in this. Not a good look for Roosevelt, and he calls in La Guardia. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what he does there and kind of use that to expand on his relationship with African Americans and that whole situation.
Yeah, LaGuardia had a wonderful relationship with the African American community. It was tempestuous at times as well, right? And but for the most part, African Americans supported LaGuardia in part because he was a Republican. And my students are always amazed to learn that if you were African American, before 1960, odds are you were Republican. Jackie Robinson was a Republican, right? So LaGuardia was a member of the party of Lincoln. So he had a natural constituency. He lived in East Harlem at a time when Harlem, which is next door, was becoming, the most famous African-American community in America. So in 1940, when A. Philip Randolph is basically saying to Roosevelt, look, you've got to make sure that the defense industry, which is hiring people by the hundreds of thousands now, that they're hiring black people as well as white people. Otherwise, we're going to march. And, Roosevelt doesn't take this too seriously. Randolph is very friendly with LaGuardia and, consults with LaGuardia on this. And at one point, Roosevelt brings LaGuardia into negotiations with A. Philip Randolph about this proposed march on Washington. And at a meeting, and I forget the exact time period, but I think it was springtime of 1940, Randolph comes in and basically in the Oval Office. And some of this is LaGuardia himself wrote about. There's also a meeting that you can get on Google that's that was on tape. Apparently Roosevelt also taped some of those Oval Office meetings. Yeah. No, I didn't
Everything
know that.
happened before it happened, right? Nothing ever happened for the first time.
But and if you listen to this tape, and it's sketchy, it's staticky, it's not good quality, but it's pretty clear. Like Randolph is telling Roosevelt, "I'm not kidding. I'm going to do this." So they bring in Roosevelt. They bring in LaGuardia in to meet with Philip Randolph and other black leaders and other cabinet members. And Roosevelt, part of their demand, also, by the way, was to desegregate the armed forces,
right,
and the government. And Roosevelt is taken aback. Like at one point, he says, "You mean the government of the United States?" Philip Randolph says, "Yeah, that one," right? So LaGuardia intervenes when things are getting heated between Roosevelt and A. Philip Randolph and says, "Look, Mr. President, it's pretty clear that Mr. Randolph is a man of his word. So why don't we go back and see if we can figure something out?" And over the course of 5 days, they do come up with a compromise that Roosevelt is going to issue an executive order basically desegregating the nation's defense factories, but not desegregate the military, right? Or the federal government, for that matter. So Randolph and the other leaders of the NAACP are okay with this. And I imagine, I don't know for the fact, but I imagine LaGuardia may have had something to do with, telling the black community, look, this is good. You want to take it. So Roosevelt issued that famous, I think it's Executive Order number 40, but it's a famous document in which he said that you can't discriminate in the defense industry.
So we talked, I think it was, here's my memories on display, but we talked, I think it was to the author of the book about Anna Rosenberg, who was also involved in this. And she was good friends with Fiorello La Guardia, who apparently drove her to work every day. But he suggested that the final result of this ended up, it worked for FDR because it was a bit toothless. Did it have an impact, or was it something that was more, the impact was we say we're going to do this, and that's the impact?
In all honesty, I'm not a student of that. One of the things I learned as a PhD, the late or knife PhD, is I'm allowed to say things like, "That's not my field." And that's, as a journalist, As a journalist, you can't say that because you're supposed to be an expert in everything, right?
Right.
But as an academic, I will say, in all honesty, in all modesty, that's not my field. I don't know that that's true. I would imagine, though, that if African Americans were now getting jobs, well-paying jobs in the defense industry that they had not been getting before, I imagine that that's a good thing. That is, it's not just symbolism; it's something real. But somebody far smarter than me, which is most of the planet, might be able to know, well, actually, they didn't get those jobs. I honestly don't know.
But Terry, I mean, what you mentioned in the book, and I'm sorry, I can't remember his name, but there's a leader of the African American community in Harlem, who's you talk about in the book, but is very critical of LaGuardia.
Yes.
And thank you,
Adam Clayton Powell.
Yeah. So, and what are his criticisms? I mean, what is it?
He's not doing enough. Yeah, well, his criticisms are at the municipal level, not at the national level. But his criticisms are that LaGuardia is presiding over a city where big companies like Macy's, just basically say we're not going to hire black people, which is just unbelievable, right? And he felt that LaGuardia was not doing enough to alleviate the horrendous housing in Harlem. So he felt that LaGuardia was more talk and not enough action. I mean, Adam Clayton Powell was an interesting character too. He's later elected to Congress and later gets into all sorts of corruption issues. But at the time, he was this young, dynamic leader of the Harlem community. I mean, he was Al Sharpton in 1941, and he was not one to praise public officials. But when there was a race riot in Harlem in 1943. And LaGuardia walked the streets of Harlem and tried to keep order. Adam Clayton Powell was among the people who said, he did a pretty good job.
Right.
So one of the things that you brought up in the book is the thing that you said that probably most Americans, at least of a certain age, would know Fiorello La Guardia for, aside from the airport, which is reading the comics on the radio. And if you'd set us up a little bit as to what's going on there, I am going to attempt with my normal technical skills, and I already flashed something on the screen, I'm going to attempt to play a YouTube clip, which is him doing this. So we get to actually hear Fiorello La Guardia talking about Dick Tracy and the Slender Detectives. But to tell us about the circumstances of this.
Well, the newspaper distributors went on strike, not the journalists themselves, but the people who actually distribute the newspapers to newsstands went on strike in July of 1945. And LaGuardia loved the comics. He really followed Little Orphan Annie and Dick Tracy in particular. In fact, at one point, one of his staffers tells a story that he's young, he's in the back seat with LaGuardia, and and LaGuardia's reading the funnies, and he brings up something. Mr. Major, what about that? Don't interrupt me when I'm reading the funnies, right? So he really thought this was terrible that the young children of the New York City area were not going to be able to read the comics. So New York City still has a radio station called WNYC, although it's now an NPR station. At the time, it was run by the city government, right? So he had a Sunday morning show called Talk to the People. And he used that show I think it was actually on July 2nd or early on, to say, now that I've talked to the adults, I'm now going to read the comics on the air. He didn't read them all. I think it was just Dick Tracy and Little Orphan Annie. So he did it. It was a tremendous success. All the newspapers wrote about it the next day. The problem was, of course, nobody could read the newspapers because the newspaper distributors were on strike. So for the next 2 Sundays, he read it. In fact, the clip, I think if you can find it, it was such a hit, of course, that the newsreel cameras were on hand for the second reading of the Sunday comics. Mind you, it's the Sunday comics, not the dailies. And then he did it one more time, and that's it. I think I was surprised. I'm not old enough to remember this, but I certainly, my parents talked about LaGuardia reading the comics and everything else. I thought it was a regular thing. I just assumed he did it for most of his mayoralty. He did it 3 times, probably for a total of maybe 6 minutes.
All right, let's see how we do here with playing this clip. And now I'm going to have to. Oh, where's it gone? Okay.
Anticipation.
Next picture you
Can
see
you hear
is
it?
Dick Tracy.
Oh yeah.
You know the fine type of Dick Tracy? He's been a detective so long, and he still has that slender form. Lou Valentine, why do our detectives get fat, I wonder? Well, anyhow, here's Tracy, and he's asking. The only vehicle that left the house at that time was one of your laundry trucks. I'd like to question the driver. That district, Mr. Tracy, is covered by wet wash, Wally. He should be checking in at any time. Not very long, not very soon, from that crash he got on the noodle with that iron pot. And say, children, what does it all mean? It means that dirty money never brings any luck.
Could you hear that? Okay.
That was great.
So,
So the first,
he's
the first reference was to his police commissioner, Lou Valentine. That's what he's
who's
saying.
who's undoubtedly there with him. Yeah.
Yeah,
Or-
he's basically saying, well, he assumed Lou Valentine would be listening, as all of his commissioners had better have been listening, and just say, "Hey, Lou, like, what's the deal? Why are our why do all of our detectives look like me, right? Instead of slender Dick Tracy? I wonder," he says. He's actually thinking, I know why they're not doing their jobs.
Right.
And then he's got at the end, he's dirty money doesn't pay. So he's
Right.
there's a moral in it, children.
Yes. Well, and later on in the last installment in his readings, the following week, he reads from Little Orphan Annie, who, for reasons which remain obscure, was being brought up on murder charges. Yes, murder, Little Orphan Annie, and she's in front of a corrupt judge who's clearly railroading her. And at that point, he pauses and says, just the other day, I appointed some judges, and unlike the judge in this case, he wouldn't have been. These aren't people from the social register. They're just normal New Yorkers. Do you know what I'm saying? They're normal New Yorkers, just like. So those are the kinds of judges I appoint. Not like this judge. He's got a message going. And mind you, he wasn't running for re-election. At that point, he had already said he wasn't going to run for a fourth term. So he was, the lamest of lame ducks. But he couldn't resist injecting a little morality. LaGuardia was very self-righteous, which I'm sure did not make him especially popular with all of his colleagues.
So Terry, one of the things that I was really interested in, and I'd like to learn a little bit more about is, obviously, justifiably, we concentrate on his time in New York and as mayor of New York City, but during the war, he does take on other roles. And one of the roles that he takes on is, I guess Roosevelt sends him to London, and he makes a radio broadcast, or he broadcasts to London, and it goes out. So I'd like to know a little bit more about that, and what was the reaction to LaGuardia's speech? I mean, did this make him an international figure? Was he still very much a New York figure? Or what impact did this have? And did people in England say, "Hey, LaGuardia is great," or "Who is this guy?" Or
No, I think LaGuardia already was a global figure. I mean, one of the things about that time period and the way in his use of the media and his personality is that people love to cover Fiorello La Guardia. So I think people in London would have known his name. But yes, because LaGuardia was such a natural on radio and so very different from Franklin Roosevelt, who was also a natural on radio, right? But because of his exuberant personality, because of his sort of just folks kind of persona, Roosevelt had him deliver sort of a morale boosting speech in which he referred to the Axis powers individually by names maybe we wouldn't say in polite society anymore.
Oh, go ahead. Tell us.
But I think he already was quite a figure globally, or certainly at least in Western Europe by then, but it certainly cemented his relationship. And he also, of course, had a wonderful memory of his time in Italy, where the Wilson administration realized we want to reassure our allies. This is during World War I. We want to reassure our allies in Italy, so they have Major LaGuardia go around giving speeches. Many of them, were but they weren't broadcast on radio because radio didn't exist really at that time. But he was going around talking to audiences in Italy in LaGuardian Italian, which I think is a little different from regular Italian. But he was a hit. I mean, people loved Fiorello La Guardia, except maybe some of the people who worked for him. But people did love him because he just seemed so approachable and seemed to understand them. And, my grandparents used to tell me about Franklin Roosevelt on the radio, that the magic of Franklin Roosevelt. And these were Republicans. Franklin Roosevelt, it seemed like he was talking to them personally on the radio. And I think LaGuardia had that in a very no one will ever confuse Roosevelt and LaGuardia on the radio, but LaGuardia had that same thing going too.
We're just about at the end of our show. Let me just ask you one question. I think of the great mayors of the past: LaGuardia in New York, Curley in Boston, Daley in Chicago, Bradley in Los Angeles. They're not really remembered the same way as maybe senators and governors, in my view. It's sort of easy to kind of let go of mayors. Do you agree that that's the case? And if you do agree, why do you think it's the case?
Well, mayors are by definition local figures, right? I mean, how many people? Right, Curley. The difference between LaGuardia and Curley, of course, is that LaGuardia didn't go to jail.
Okay.
Curley was a major figure. I mean, he was governor for a term too, right? But mayors are local figures. But I would argue that LaGuardia sort of transcended that because of New York's importance. And because he made sure that the rest of the world knew who he was, right? And not every mayor has that ambition. James Michael Curley didn't ever want to be anything really but mayor, right? Daley certainly never wanted to be anything but mayor. I can't speak for Bradley in Los Angeles. I don't know him that well. But most mayors are content. In fact, in New York, no mayor of New York has ever gone on to win any other office. None. Well, since the Civil War, I should say that. Since the Civil War, no New York mayor has then gone on to win. So none. So, I mean, you're right. They are local figures who don't necessarily translate well to the wider world.
Terry Golway, thank you so much for joining us today. And Terry is the author of the book, I Never Did Like Politics, How Fiorello La Guardia Became America's Mayor. We didn't even talk about that phrase, and why he still matters. And so his book goes on sale a week from Tuesday, right?
Yes.
A week from Tuesday? Yes. So, but you can pre-order now. So go to Amazon, pre-order, and make Terry
get ahead of the curve. Yes.
All right. Terry, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Okay, Chris, people are probably going to be fleeing now to go to their Super Bowl party. So go ahead. It's Kansas City versus San Francisco. Give us your Super Bowl prediction.
Who are the teams again?
My prediction is that what's her name? Taylor Swift will show up, and
go Taylor Swift. There we go.
People will make a big deal out of it, and I think I'm going to root in favor of whoever scores the first touchdown. I'm rooting in favor of the other team. Okay, that's
go other team.
That's how I'm doing that. Next week, we'll get back to an area that you know something about, Chris.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Which is World War II. Our guest is NCR Davis, and she's going to talk about the book she wrote about her mother, For the Boys, the war story of a combat nurse in Patton's Third Army. So I think that's a perspective on World War II that we haven't done yet. So I'm looking forward to kind of learning about those experiences and what we can figure out on that.
Absolutely. So.
Please, guys, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, think about us during the Super Bowl, listen to our podcast, and back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Be safe.
Oh, hang on. I'm pushing the wrong button. Oh, my God.